The night Maria Sawyer told him she was leaving, the fire in the hearth had burned down to nothing but red coals, and the silence between them was louder than any storm that had ever rolled across the Texas panhandle. It was the autumn of 1878, and the land around the small settlement of Calla Creek was the kind of beautiful that breaks your heart, endless golden grasslands stretching out beneath skies so wide and blue they made a person feel both free and terribly small at once. The cottonwood trees along the creek had gone to their fall colors, trembling yellow and amber in the dry October wind, and the smell of wood smoke and dry earth was everywhere. Calla Creek was not much of a town. It had a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a saloon that the preacher pretended did not exist, and a scattering of homesteads spreading out from its center like spokes on a wheel that had been put together by someone who was not paying close attention. Maria Sawyer was 24 years old, and she had lived in Calla Creek for 3 years that had felt like a single long gray season with no clear beginning and no promise of an end. She had come there from San Antonio following her husband, Thomas Sawyer, a man who had spoken about the future of Texas cattle ranching with the conviction of a preacher, and the ambition of a man who had never once looked honestly at his own limitations. Thomas had bought 40 acres from a man who had disappeared shortly after the transaction, and the land had turned out to be mostly rocky hardpan with a seasonal creek that dried up every July and stayed dry until November. Thomas had worked himself into the ground over it, and then he had gotten sick, a fever that the traveling doctor said came from bad water, and he had died on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1877, while Maria held his hand and watched the sun come up through the dirty window of their little house. She had stayed on through the grief because she had nowhere else to go, and because leaving felt like admitting that everything Thomas had believed in was worthless, and she could not do that to his memory. She had kept the house and the small garden and the 2 horses, and she had worked at the general store 3 days a week for Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, and she had been, in the truest sense of the word, enduring rather than living. Gideon Abbott had come to Calla Creek in the spring of 1878, which made him 6 months a resident when everything between them began to change. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar when the weather was humid, and eyes the color of good whiskey held up to the light brown with a warmth in them that surprised people who expected a man of his size and quietness to be cold. He had ridden into town on a big roan horse named Redeemer, with a bedroll behind his saddle and a rifle in his scabbard, and very little else to speak of. He had taken the position of deputy under Sheriff Calvin Purdy, a man who was getting on in years and whose knees had gone stiff enough that he no longer chased anyone on foot. Gideon had not talked much about where he came from, and in Calla Creek, as in most small towns on the Texas frontier, a man's past was considered his own business unless he chose to share it. What people observed about Gideon Abbott was that he was steady. He was the kind of man who showed up when he said he would. He did not drink to excess at the saloon, though he was known to take a glass of rye on a cold evening. He was polite to the women of the town and respectful to the older men, and patient with the children who tried to follow him around on account of the badge. And he had a particular way of looking at a thing, a horse, a length of fence, a troubled face with his head tilted just slightly to the side and his eyes gone very still, as though he was trying to understand it from every angle before he said a single word about it. Maria had first spoken to him properly in June of that year, when she was carrying 2 heavy crates of tinned goods from Mr. Holloway's back storeroom to the shelf at the front of the store, and she had misjudged the corner of the doorframe and sent tins of peaches and condensed milk clattering across the wooden floor in every direction. Gideon had been in the store picking up a tin of tobacco, and he had immediately set down what he was holding and begun gathering up the runaway tins without a word, handing them to her one by one with a quiet attentiveness that she had not expected from a man she had observed to be largely uninterested in unnecessary conversation. "Thank you," she had said, her face warm with the embarrassment of it. "It was the corner," he had said simply. "That doorframe juts out about half an inch too far on the right side. I've noticed it myself." It was such a practical, unpatronizing thing to say that she had looked at him properly for the first time, and he had looked back at her with those steady amber-brown eyes, and something in the air between them had shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a compass needle trembles when it finds true north. They had spoken after that the way people speak in small towns, at the store, on the street, occasionally at Sunday services in the church, where Reverend Moss preached long sermons that tested the endurance of even the most devout. They spoke about practical things: the weather, the state of the roads, whether the Holloways were going to get a new shipment of flour before the week was out. But underneath those ordinary exchanges, something was accumulating quietly, the way water gathers behind a dam, not visible on the surface, but building in pressure and weight with every passing week. It was in August that things began to change in a way that neither of them could entirely ignore. The town of Calla Creek had been experiencing a problem with a man named Harlan Voss, who ran a small operation about 12 miles west of town, and who had taken it into his head that certain water rights along the creek belonged to him, despite the fact that the county survey said otherwise. Harlan Voss was not a violent man by nature, but he was stubborn and aggrieved, and he had 3 hired hands who were less restrained in temperament than he was, and there had been some ugly confrontations between those hands and the smaller homesteaders who drew water from the same creek. Gideon had ridden out to the Voss property twice to speak with Harlan about it, and both times the conversation had ended in stalemate. On the third occasion, one of Voss's men had shoved Gideon in the chest on the porch of the Voss house, a man named Cutter Ames who was known for his quick temper and quicker hands. Gideon had not flinched and had not raised his fists, which was the thing that everyone talked about afterward. He had simply looked at the man with that level, unhurried gaze until Cutter Ames had taken a step back without quite knowing why he had done it. And then Gideon had said quietly that the next time anyone put their hands on a county officer, there would be legal consequences that none of them would enjoy, and he had gotten back on Redeemer and ridden back to town. Maria had heard the story from Sheriff Purdy, who told it with the admiration of a man who had once relied on his own fists more than his judgment and had come to regret it. She had found herself thinking about it for the rest of the day, not the confrontation exactly, but the restraint of it. The willingness to hold steady when every instinct might have said otherwise. She had taken him a piece of apple pie that evening. She told herself it was because she had made too much and it would go to waste, which was partially true. She found him on the porch of the little house behind the sheriff's office where he lived, sitting in a wooden chair with his hat off and a book open on his knee. She had not expected the book, watching the last of the sunset drain out of the western sky. He had looked up, and the expression on his face when he saw her was one she would think about for a long time afterward. Not surprise exactly, but something softer than surprise. Something that looked very much like gladness. "Mrs. Sawyer," he had said. "I have too much pie," she had said, holding out the plate. He had looked at the pie and then back at her, and the corner of his mouth had lifted in a way that transformed his whole face. "I am not going to argue with that," he had said. She had sat in the other chair on the porch, the one that was there for no one in particular, and they had talked until the stars came out fully over the Texas plain, and the coyotes had begun their distant conversation somewhere out in the grass, and neither of them had wanted to be the one to say it was time to go home. After that evening, there was a different quality to the air between them. It was still proper Maria was a widow, and the town observed such things, and Gideon was not a man who pushed against the proprieties with any kind of agenda, but it was warmer. He began to stop by the store more often than tobacco could account for. She began to find reasons to walk past the sheriff's office on her way to the creek in the evenings. They had dinner together twice at the Holloway house, where Mrs. Holloway, A woman of 60 with sharp eyes and a warm heart watched them with the satisfied expression of someone doing a complicated puzzle and finding that the pieces were falling into place. September came, and with it, a long dry spell that cracked the earth and made the stock restless and put a kind of edge on everyone's temper. It was during this stretch that Maria received a letter from her sister, Clara, who lived in the town of Abilene with her husband and 2 young children. The letter had been written 3 weeks before it arrived, as letters in that country were accustomed to being, and it contained news that Maria read twice, standing behind the counter of the general store on a hot Tuesday afternoon, with the sound of flies buzzing in the window above the dry goods. Clara wrote that their mother, who lived in San Antonio, was unwell. Not dangerously so, the letter insisted, but unwell enough that she was struggling to manage the house and would benefit greatly from having someone with her. Clara could not go herself because her youngest child was only 8 months old, and the journey was too long with an infant, and their brother James was in Colorado and not expected back before winter. Maria was the logical person to go. The letter asked in Clara's straightforward way if Maria would consider it, and pointed out, with the gentle tactlessness of a loving sister, that there was nothing holding Maria in Calla Creek anyway, was there. Maria had folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, and she had stood behind the counter for the rest of the afternoon with a smile on her face that felt like it had been painted there by someone else, and she had thought about what it would mean to leave. She thought about it for 2 weeks. She thought about her mother's face, soft and tired, and the house in San Antonio where she had grown up, and the obligation of family which in that era and place was not a casual thing but a deep moral weight. She thought about Clara's words, nothing holding her in Calla Creek, and felt the truth of them like a thorn in her side. She had a house she barely managed to keep, a job that paid enough to eat but not enough to do much else, and a life that had been built around a man who was no longer in it. She tried not to think about Gideon Abbott while she was making this decision, because thinking about him complicated it in a way she was not prepared to examine fully. What was between them, for all its warmth and its accumulating weight, had never been spoken aloud. He had not made any declaration. She had not made any indication that she expected one. They were 2 people who found each other's company profoundly comfortable, and that was what it was, and it was not a reason to decline to go to her ailing mother. On the 14th of October, which was a Sunday, she made up her mind. She went to the church service and listened to Reverend Moss with more attention than usual, feeling the solemnity of the decision settling into her like the first cold of autumn. Afterward, while the congregation stood about in the yard and the children ran between the legs of the adults, she approached Gideon where he stood with Sheriff Purdy and told him she needed to speak with him when he had a moment. He had come to her house that evening. She had made coffee, and they had sat at the table in her small kitchen, where the last of the evening light came in through the western window and turned everything amber and gold. She had told him about the letter, about her mother, about Clara's question. Nothing holding her in Calla Creek was there. And she had said it in a straightforward way that she hoped concealed the ache of it, and she told him she would be leaving at first light on Tuesday morning, if she could get a ride with the freight wagon as far as Abilene. The silence that followed was the one that would stay with her longest. Not an empty silence. It was full of things neither of them had learned to say yet. Gideon sat across from her at the small table with his coffee cup held in both hands and his eyes on her face, and he was very still in the way he got when he was thinking hard about something. The lamplight made the lines of his face look carved, and she was aware with a sharp and sudden clarity of how much she was going to miss looking at him, and the realization hurt more than she had prepared herself for. "Your mother," he said at last, and there was something in his voice that she could not entirely read. "Is she badly off?" "I don't know," Maria said honestly. "Clara says not dangerously, but Clara has a tendency to soften things in letters." He nodded slowly. And you would go to San Antonio. I would go to Abilene first to see Clara and then, yes, to San Antonio. Another silence. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Is that where you'd stay? It was a careful question. She understood what was underneath it, and her heart did something complicated in her chest. I don't know, she said again, and this time the honesty of it was harder to give. My life is there in a sense. My family is there. I have been. She stopped. She tried again. I have been here because Thomas brought me here. Without Thomas, the reasons to stay are fewer than they were. He looked at her for a long moment, and the expression in his eyes was the most open she had ever seen him. All the careful restraint that he ordinarily kept in place gone somewhere, and what was underneath it was unmistakable, and it made her breath go shallow. Then he put the coffee cup down on the table very carefully and stood up and put his hat on. I'll leave you to your packing, he said, and his voice was steady but not all the way. If you need the freight wagon sorted, I can speak to Pete Granger in the morning. I already spoke to him, she said. He has room on Tuesday. Good. He stood by the door for a moment with his hand on the frame. I'm glad your mother has you to go to her. He left, and Maria sat at her table in the lamplight for a long time after the sound of his boots on the porch had faded, and she told herself very firmly that this was the right thing to do, and she almost believed it. She spent Monday packing. There was not so much to pack. She was not taking everything, only what she needed for a few weeks, maybe longer, and she told Mrs. Holloway she would send word when she knew her plans more clearly. Mrs. Holloway had pressed her hands and looked at her with those sharp, kind eyes and had not said what she was clearly thinking, and Maria had been grateful for that. That night she could not sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the wind come down off the plain, rattling the window latch, and she thought about Gideon's face at the table when she had told him. She thought about the thing in his eyes before he had put it away. She thought about nothing holding her here, and she thought about the precise, particular quality of what she would be leaving behind. At some point before dawn, she rose and dressed by candlelight and carried her bags to the porch. The sky was still fully dark and full of stars, the kind of deep blue-black that exists only in that last hour before the horizon begins to change, and the air was cold enough to see her breath, and the whole world was quiet except for the wind and the distant singing of some night bird in the cottonwoods along the creek. She was standing on the porch with her bags at her feet and her coat buttoned to her chin when she saw the lantern coming up the road from the direction of the livery stable. She watched it, puzzled, as it came closer, and as it came into the light she understood what she was seeing. Gideon Abbott was walking toward her house leading 2 horses, his own roan Redeemer and her chestnut mare Belle, both of them saddled and bridled with their saddlebags already packed, their breath making small clouds in the cold morning air, their hooves quiet on the frozen ground. He carried the lantern in his free hand, and when the light caught his face she could see that he had not slept either, and she could see that he had made a decision, and the clarity and the steadiness of it were in every line of him. He stopped at the gate to her yard and looked up at her on the porch. I have the horses saddled, he said. I am coming with you. Maria stood very still on her porch in the pre-dawn dark with her breath caught in her chest, looking down at this man, and the 2 horses, and the lantern and the great wide open blackness of the Texas sky behind him, and she had never in her life been as undone by anything as she was by the plainness of what he had just said. Gideon, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. I know I don't have any right to say what I am about to say, he told her, and his voice was low and even, but there was an urgency underneath it that she could feel from across the yard. I know I've been slow to say it, slower than I should have been, maybe. But if you are leaving this morning, I need to tell you before you go, because I will not sleep soundly for the rest of my natural life if I let you leave without saying it. She came down off the porch steps slowly, as though moving too quickly might break something. The cold air hit her face, and the frost was silver on the ground between them. She stopped at the gate and looked up at him. Maria, he said, and the way he said her name, just her name, without the Mrs. Sawyer that everyone else used, as if the formality had become irrelevant between them, made her eyes sting unexpectedly. I have been in this town 6 months, and every good thing I can say about those 6 months, you are somewhere in the middle of it. You are the smartest person I have spoken to in longer than I can remember, and the kindest. And when I am in your company, I feel more like the man I am trying to be than I do at any other time. And I know this is not the proper way of going about it. And I know you have a life and a family and reasons to go south, and I am not asking you not to go. I am only asking if I can come with you, because I cannot watch you ride away and not know when or whether you are coming back. The horses stood patient in the dark behind him, breathing their quiet white breaths. Somewhere on the creek a night bird called again. Maria looked at Gideon Abbott and felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time because she had not believed she was entitled to it, which was hope's simple, overwhelming, frightening hope. You would leave your position, she said. You would leave Calla Creek. I spoke to Sheriff Purdy last night, he said. He has a nephew in Amarillo who has been looking for deputy work. He will manage. She stared at him. You spoke to Sheriff Purdy last night. I could not sleep, he said, with a simplicity that made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. Gideon, she said again. I know, he said. You have not asked for any of this. You can tell me no, and I will unsaddle Belle and wish you well, and that will be the end of it, and I will not make it difficult for you. She stood at the gate looking at him for a long moment, and she thought about all the months of standing in the vicinity of him, all the coffee on the porch, and the conversations about practical things that were really about something deeper, all the evenings when neither of them wanted to be the one to say it was getting late, all the times she had looked at him across a room, and felt something wake up in her that she had thought the grief had put out for good. And she thought about what it would mean to ride away in the freight wagon while he stood at the side of the road with his hat in his hands. She reached out and unlatched the gate. You have already got the horses saddled, she said. It would be a shame to waste the effort. The expression that crossed his face then was one she would spend the rest of her life being grateful she had caused a whole sunrise's worth of relief and warmth and joy compressed into a single moment, and he ducked his head briefly in a way that looked almost like a man catching himself before he was overwhelmed by his own feelings, and when he looked back up his eyes were bright. Yes, ma'am, he said. She picked up her bags from the porch, and he took them from her with a naturalness that felt as though they had been doing this for years, and he tied them to Belle's saddlebag fittings with quick, competent hands. She went to Belle's head and stroked the mare's nose, and the horse leaned into her palm with the deep familiar trust of an animal that knows its person. They rode out of Calla Creek as the sky to the east began its first faint staining of purple-gray along the horizon, and the town was still asleep behind them. The dark windows of the store, the cold chimney of the church, the soft snoring of a town that did not yet know it was losing its deputy, and ahead of them was the open country, rolling and vast and pale in the first light, stretching all the way to wherever they were going. For a long while they rode without speaking, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have just changed their lives and are sitting inside the enormity of that, feeling it settle around them like the cold morning air. The sky lightened incrementally, first that bruised purple, then a long band of deep orange along the eastern horizon, then the full spreading gold of the early sun breaking over the flat line of the plain, and everything the light touched turned from gray to color, the dry grass going to amber and copper, the horses' coats going to warm red and chestnut, Gideon's face beside her going from shadow to something she wanted to look at for a very long time. Tell me about your mother, he said after they had been riding perhaps 2 hours and the sun was fully up and the cold was burning off. So she did. She told him about Isabel Reyes. Her mother had been born in Mexico, had come to Texas as a young woman with her own parents, and had married Maria's father, a merchant named Edward Reyes who had been half Irish and half stubborn and had died of a heart ailment when Maria was 16. She told him about the house in San Antonio, The small garden with the roses that her mother kept with a devotion that bordered on religious. The way her mother made coffee with a cinnamon stick in it, and told stories about people she had known in Chihuahua when she was a girl. She told him about Clara, who had always been the practical one, and who had married a man named Beau Hart who ran a mercantile supply business, and was cheerfully dull and deeply reliable, and exactly what Clara needed. She told him about her brother James, who was somewhere in Colorado looking for silver in the mountains and writing letters approximately every 4 months. Gideon listened with that full attention he gave to things, asking a question now and then, not the polite questions of someone performing interest, but the real questions of someone building a picture. "What about your father's people?" he asked. "I never knew them well," she said. "His parents had died before I was old enough to remember them, and he had a brother in Missouri who we saw maybe twice. His family was the kind that had spread out and lost the threads between them." He nodded, looking out across the grass. "What about yours?" she asked, because it seemed fair, and because she had always been curious about the parts of him she did not yet know. He was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if she had pushed at something that was not ready to be opened. But he said, without any particular darkness to it, "My parents had a farm in Tennessee. I left when I was 19. My father and I had different ideas about the kind of man I should be." He paused. He was not cruel. He was just very certain about things and very uncomfortable with anyone who was certain about different things. We couldn't seem to find any air to breathe in the same room. "Did you leave badly?" "Not badly enough to be unforgivable, I think. We corresponded some. He passed 4 years ago. My mother is still in Tennessee, but she is well, last I heard, living with my younger sister and her husband." "Do you miss Tennessee?" He thought about it genuinely, and she appreciated that about him, the way he thought about answers before he gave them. "I miss the green of it," he said at last. "Texas is beautiful, but it is not green in the way Tennessee is green." "But no, not really. This is where I feel like I fit." They made good progress that first day, the land being flat enough and the roads being decent by the standards of that country, which meant they were passable but not comfortable. By midday they had covered a fair stretch and stopped to water the horses at a shallow creek and eat the biscuits and dried beef that Gideon had thought to pack. She realized, which meant he had planned this more thoroughly than she had understood, and the thought of him in his small house behind the sheriff's office the night before, packing saddlebags and making arrangements with the sheriff, and thinking through the provisions with that careful, methodical attention he brought to everything, filled her with a warmth she did not know what to do with. They sat on the bank of the creek while the horses drank, and the sun was high and warm in a way that October in Texas could be, generously warm in the middle of the day before it plunged cold again after sundown, and a sissortail flycatcher sat on a nearby branch and regarded them with bright disapproval. "I should tell you something," Maria said. He looked at her. "I am not a certain kind of woman," she said, and she chose her words with care because she wanted to be honest with him, and also because she had spent enough time in the frontier west to know that certain kinds of honesty took courage. I do not intend to go back to being small." Thomas was a good man in many ways, but he had ideas about what a wife's life should look like, and I tried to fit inside those ideas, and I was not always able to. I have opinions, and I am likely to share them, and I do not like being told what to do without a good reason for it. She paused. "I wanted to tell you that before you came much further on this road." Gideon looked at her with that tilted attention, and then the corner of his mouth curved upward. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said, and the deliberate use of the formality in that context made it into a kind of gentle teasing. "I have been in your company most of every week for 6 months. I am aware that you have opinions. I want to be sure you understand it is not temporary." "I understand," he said, and the warmth in his voice was real and steady. "For what it is worth, I do not want someone who fits inside a shape I have decided on. I have seen marriages like that and they look like two people slowly disappearing." He looked out at the creek. "I want someone beside me, not in front and not behind. The scissortail flycatcher departed from its branch in a burst of gray and white and salmon pink, and Maria looked at Gideon Abbott in the warm October noon and felt something she could not name settle into place in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten she was carrying. They reached a small town called Meadow Stand by evening, a community of perhaps 80 people that had grown up at a crossroads of two cattle trails, and they found rooms at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Croft, who had iron-gray hair and the direct manner of a woman who had been making her own decisions for 30 years. Mrs. Croft gave Maria the best room at the front of the house and Gideon the back room, and she served them a supper of stewed beef and cornbread and dried apple pie, and she watched them across her supper table with the uncomplicated interest of someone who had seen enough of the world to know a love story when it sat at her table. "You married?" she asked with the bluntness of age. "No," Maria said. "Heading somewhere particular." "San Antonio," Gideon said. "Her mother is unwell." Mrs. Croft looked at him, then at Maria, and she said, "Well, it's good she's not traveling alone. Roads south of here have been unsettled lately. There was a dispute between two of the big ranchers over water rights, and some of the hired men have been causing trouble for travelers." It was not the first time Maria had heard this. The water disputes of the late 1870s were a constant undercurrent of life on the Texas frontier. The growth of the cattle industry and the long droughts of the decade had put ranchers in conflict over every creek and spring and river access in the territory, and the men who worked for those ranchers were not always careful about the line between defending their employers' interests and simply making trouble for anyone they did not recognize. Gideon had asked Mrs. Croft for what detail she knew about the situation, and the landlady had told them that a man named Garrett, who ran a large cattle operation south of the town of Concho, had been at war with a neighboring rancher named Finch over water access to the Concho River, and that Garrett's men in particular had taken to stopping travelers on the road and demanding they state their business and their destination in ways that were aggressive enough to have frightened several people into turning back. "We'll give the Concho route a wider berth," Gideon had said, and Mrs. Croft had nodded her approval. That night, in her room at the front of Mrs. Croft's boarding house, Maria lay awake listening to the sounds of the small town settling into night. A dog somewhere, a horse in the stable, the low murmur of voices from the saloon down the street. And she thought about the fact that Gideon Abbott had come with her, had saddled the horses in the dark and walked up to her gate and said, "I am coming with you," and she was still not entirely sure she had not invented it. She put her hand flat on the wall beside her bed, the wall that backed onto the next room, not his room, but still the same house where he was sleeping, and she let herself acknowledge, quietly and without ceremony, that she was in love with him. Had been probably for longer than she had allowed herself to know. Had been since some ordinary moment months ago that she could not precisely identify, the way you cannot identify the exact moment summer becomes fall, only notice one day that the light is different. The next morning they rode on, skirting west of the Concho route as Gideon had decided, which added some miles but kept them clear of Garrett's men. The land changed as they moved south, a little more rolling, the grass giving way in places to caliche and thin cedar and low mesquite, the sky, if anything, even larger than it had been farther north. They fell into the rhythm of travel easily, which surprised Maria a little, because she had always understood travel to be a test of people's characters, in the way that ordinary life was not. You could not be polite for every moment of a long ride, could not maintain any face that was not genuinely yours. And what she found in Gideon across the miles was exactly what she had expected, and also, in small ways, more than she had known to expect. He was companionable in a quiet way that did not demand anything from her, did not need her to be entertaining or conversational on the mornings when she was tired and wanted to ride in comfortable silence, but was also genuinely present and engaged when she felt like talking, which was most of the time. He was competent in the steady practical ways that traveling in that country required. He knew how to read weather, how to manage the horses across difficult ground, how to make camp with efficiency when they were too far from a town to reach it by dark. He made good coffee over an open fire, which she decided was one of the most underrated qualities in a person. And he was funny, which she had known somewhat but now came to understand more fully. Not in a performing way, he did not tell jokes or seek to be entertaining, but in a dry, understated way, a word or an observation delivered so quietly and precisely that you sometimes did not catch it for a second, and then you laughed unexpectedly, which was the best kind of laughing. On their second evening, camped beside a thin creek under a sky full of more stars than seemed possible, he said, while looking at the fire, "I should tell you something as well since you were honest with me yesterday." She looked at him across the fire. "I was engaged once," he said. "About 3 years ago in a town called Harker's Crossing in New Mexico Territory. Her name was Ellen. She was the school teacher." He was quiet for a moment. "We were engaged for 5 months, and then she told me she had decided to go back east to Connecticut where her family was. She said that she had realized she was not, in the end, a Western woman." A pause. "I don't say this to make you feel any kind of obligation to reassure me. I say it because it is part of how I came to be in Texas, and because I have been not afraid exactly. Slow to trust, maybe, about believing that the thing I was feeling was the thing it actually was." Maria looked at him across the fire for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face and made it warm and human and a little uncertain in a way she found deeply endearing. "I am not going back to Connecticut," she said. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved. "I know that," he said. "I do know that." "I was born in San Antonio," she said. "I came back from the East once when I was 18, and I lasted 40 days before I came back to Texas. There is no Connecticut in me." He laughed a full, real laugh, low and warm, and she had not heard that precise sound before and she stored it carefully. "That is very comforting," he said. The stars turned overhead in their great slow wheel, and they talked by the fire until the wood burned down, and when the cold came properly, they said good night and bedded down under their respective blankets, and the air between them had the quality of something that was almost at its resolution, but not yet quite there. Still one conversation away from where they were going, and both of them knew it. They reached Abilene on the afternoon of their 4th day of travel. Abilene in 1878 was a town in transition. The great cattle drives that had made it one of the busiest shipping points in Texas had been shifting their routes in recent years, and the town had grown more settled and domestic without entirely losing its rougher edges. Clara and Beau Hart lived in a solid, well-built house on the better side of town, and when Maria rode up to the gate with Gideon beside her, Clara came out the front door with the quick, anxious movement of a woman who has been watching for someone for days. Clara Hart was 26, a year younger than Maria, with their mother's dark eyes and their father's forthright manner. She took one look at Maria and embraced her fiercely, and then she pulled back and looked at Gideon with a frank curiosity that was entirely characteristic. "Who is this?" she said, not rudely but with the directness of a woman who saw no reason to dance around a question. "Gideon Abbott," Maria said. "He is—" She paused just a fraction. "He is a friend from Calla Creek. He accompanied me." Gideon touched his hat. "Mrs. Hart, I am glad to meet you." Clara looked at him and then at Maria and then back at him, and Maria could see her sister doing the arithmetic and arriving at an answer, and she watched Clara make the decision to keep that answer to herself for the time being, which was unusual enough for Clara to be impressive. "Well, come in," Clara said. "Both of you. Beau will be home for supper." Beau Hart was exactly as Maria had described him to Gideon, a solid, round-faced man of 30 with cheerful blue eyes, and the unhurried goodwill of someone who had never in his life found anything to be alarmed about. He shook Gideon's hand with genuine warmth and told him what he knew about the road south to San Antonio, and expressed without embarrassment that he was glad Maria had not made the journey alone. And Gideon received all of this with the ease of a man who was accustomed to being measured, and did not mind it because he was confident in what the measurement would find. That evening, after Bo had gone to read by the fire and the children were put to bed, Clara and Maria sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea, and Clara said without preamble, "He is in love with you." Maria cupped her tea with both hands and did not say anything. "Maria." "I know," Maria said. "And you?" The candle between them flickered in a draft from the window. "Yes," Maria said. Clara's face did the thing it did when she was trying not to be too pleased with herself. "How long?" "Some months. And neither of you has said anything." "He said something," Maria said. "The morning we left. He showed up with the horses saddled before dawn and said he was coming with me." Clara looked at her with an expression that was half exasperation and half delight. "That is the most romantic and also the most impractical thing I have ever heard." "He had spoken to the sheriff the night before," Maria said. "He had arranged it. He is not impractical." Clara shook her head slowly. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to go to San Antonio," Maria said. "I am going to see Mama, and then I think—" She stopped and started again. "I think the time has come to stop enduring things and start deciding them." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over Maria's, and for a moment they were just two sisters in a kitchen in Abilene with the smell of candle wax and tea, and all the ordinary grace of that. Gideon came to find her the next morning in Clara's small garden, where Maria was sitting on the wooden bench under the cottonwood, her face turned to the November sun which was coming through the pale fall leaves and making moving patterns of light on the ground at her feet. He sat beside her on the bench without ceremony, and he was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold morning air. "How is your sister?" he asked. "She is well," Maria said. "Her baby is enormous and cheerful. I think he may take after Bo." "Is that good?" "It is excellent," Maria said. "The world needs more enormous, cheerful men." He laughed quietly, and then they were quiet and the cottonwood leaves trembled above them. "Maria," he said. "Yes." "I want to ask you something properly," he said. "Not on a road or by a campfire or in someone else's kitchen, but I cannot seem to wait until we have a proper setting." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with that directness that had no armor in it, nothing held back. "I want to court you," he said, "properly and openly. And when the time is right, when you have been to your mother and things are clearer, I want to ask you to marry me. And I want you to know that before we go any further south, because I think you should know what my intentions are and what kind of man is riding beside you." Maria looked at him in the November light in Clara's garden in Abilene, Texas, in the year 1878, and the love she had been carrying quietly for months rose up in her with a warmth and a force that surprised even her with its completeness. "I think you should know," she said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were bright, "that I have been aware of what kind of man you are for quite some time. And I would be very glad to be courted by you, Gideon Abbott." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he took her hand the first time he had taken her hand deliberately, not in the course of helping her onto a horse or crossing a rough stretch of ground, and he held it with a carefulness that was also a kind of reverence, and she turned her hand over and let her fingers close around his, and they sat like that in the fall sunlight for a long time without saying anything at all. They stayed 2 nights in Abilene, resting the horses and themselves. Bohart told Gideon about his mercantile supply business and asked Gideon oblique, friendly questions about his prospects and his plans, and Gideon answered them with the directness of a man who had nothing to conceal and who appreciated that a woman's brother-in-law taking his measure was a reasonable and decent thing. He told Bo he had served as deputy in Calla Creek, that he had some savings, that he was considering what kind of life made sense in a larger town, San Antonio perhaps, with its established courts and law offices, where a man with his experience might find meaningful work. Bo had nodded slowly, and had offered his hand again at the end of that conversation with a warmth that was specifically different from the warmth of a general greeting, and Gideon had understood what it meant. The road to San Antonio was long and required them to travel through the Edwards Plateau country, which was beautiful in its stark limestone, and Cedar Way dry hills cut through with clear rivers. The sky very blue and enormous hawks riding the thermals above the canyon rims. They encountered no trouble from Garrett's men, having swung wide of the Concho country, and the weather held dry and cool, which made for good traveling. They crossed the Guadalupe River at a ford where the water was clear and cold over a gravel bottom, and the horses waded it happily, and climbed the far bank shaking their heads in the brightness of the afternoon. And through it all, what was between them deepened and bloomed with the unhurried certainty of something that had always been going to happen. They talked about everything, about what they had read, about what they believed, about what they hoped for, about the injustices of the country they moved through, which were impossible to ignore if you had eyes. They spoke about the way the land had been taken from the Comanche and the Kiowa, about the treaties that had been made and broken so many times they had become a kind of terrible comedy of bad faith, about the Mexican families whose land grants had been stripped from them by courts that were not impartial, about what it meant to want a life on this land while knowing the full weight of how it had been taken. These were not comfortable conversations, but they were the conversations of two people who were trying to see the world honestly, and they had them in the open way of people who trust each other. He told her about the 3 years he had spent in New Mexico territory before coming to Texas, about the land and the people and the complicated political situation there, about the Lincoln County War that had been simmering and then exploding in the territory and the lawlessness that had come out of it. He had ridden a long way from it, he said. He had seen enough of what happened when law bent itself to the interests of power rather than the interests of justice, and he had needed to find a place where the work he could do still felt like something worth doing. She told him about her years with Thomas, not with bitterness but with a kind of clear-eyed honesty that she had not given herself permission to practice before, about the loneliness of being someone whose interior life was much larger than the life they were permitted to live, about the grief that had come when Thomas died, which had been real and deep, but had also been complicated by the knowledge that she had been lonely before his death, which was a terrible thing to know about yourself. "I don't think you were wrong to be lonely," Gideon said, after she had told him this, and the simplicity of it was one of the most freeing things anyone had ever said to her. They arrived in San Antonio on a Thursday afternoon in early November. Maria had been away from it for 3 years, and the city for it was a city by the standards of the time, with its 12,000 inhabitants and its cathedral and its plazas, and the silver loops of the San Antonio River running through its heart, received her with the smells and sounds of a place that is fundamentally in the body, not just in the mind. The smell of the San Antonio River, of cedar smoke and corn masa and horse and dust, and the particular sweetness that wafts off the old mission walls in the afternoon heat, even a November afternoon. The sound of Spanish and English and the occasional German from the hill country settlers, all mixing in the market and on the streets in a way that was specific and irreplaceable. Her mother's house was a modest adobe structure in the older part of the city, near the San Fernando Cathedral, with the famous rose garden running along the east wall. The roses were bare and skeletal now in November, but even their winter architecture had a dignity to it, the canes pruned back and tied neatly, the beds mulched against the cold. Maria tied Belle to the hitching post and knocked on the door with a feeling in her chest like coming up from deep water. The door opened, and there was her mother. Isabel Reyes was 61 years old, small and fine-boned, with white hair and dark eyes that had kept their clarity and their sharpness. She was thin. Maria saw immediately, thinner than the last time she had seen her, which was 2 years ago when Maria had made the journey for a brief Christmas visit, and there was a tiredness around her eyes that was more than ordinary tiredness. But when she saw Maria, her whole face transformed, and she put both hands on Maria's face and said in the mix of Spanish and English that had always been her mode, "Mi niña, you came." "Of course I came," Maria said, and her voice was rough. Her mother looked over her shoulder at Gideon, who had stayed back a respectful step, and the dark, bright eyes moved over him with an assessment that was quick and thorough, and Maria suspected entirely accurate. "And this," Isabel said. "This is Gideon Abbott," Maria said. "He came with me. He is—" She paused and looked at Gideon and said simply, "He is mine." Gideon met the weight of her mother's gaze steadily and with respect. He removed his hat. "Mrs. Reyes," he said, "it is a privilege to meet you." Isabel looked at him for another long moment, and then she nodded once with a decisiveness that was the Isabel Reyes version of a warm welcome. "Come in," she said. "I will make coffee." The cinnamon in the coffee was exactly as Maria had described it. They settled into the house over the next several days with a naturalness that surprised Maria with its ease. Gideon found a room at a boarding house 2 streets over, and he came each morning and spent the day helping where help was needed. There were things about the house that had fallen behind in maintenance, small repairs and practical tasks that Isabel's health had prevented her from managing, and he worked at them with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He fixed the gate, replaced 2 window latches, repaired a section of adobe wall where the plaster had fallen away. He brought wood and stacked it. He was respectful of Isabel's domain and her way of doing things in it, asking what she needed rather than assuming, deferring to her preference in matters of the house with a genuine deference that was not performance. Isabel watched him. She watched him the way she had watched everything in her 61 years, with the patient thoroughness of a woman who had survived enough of the world to understand that character was the most important thing, and that it could not be hidden from long observation. After 4 days, she said to Maria, while they were sitting together in the small sitting room in the evening, "He is very steady." "He is," Maria agreed. "Not the exciting kind of steady," Isabel said. "Not the kind that pretends to be steady and is actually just slow. The real kind." Maria smiled at her sewing. "Your father was not steady," Isabel said without bitterness. "He was wonderful, your father, but he was not steady, you know this." "I know," Maria said. "Thomas was steady in some ways," Isabel said, "but he was also, how do I say it, small, inside, not in a bad way. But inside, where it matters, he was a smaller person than you." She paused. "This one is not smaller than you." Maria set down her sewing. "No," she said, "he is not." Isabel nodded with satisfaction. "Good," she said. "A woman like you needs someone who is not smaller than her. It is no good otherwise." The question of her mother's health was addressed by the doctor, a man named Dr. Vargas who had attended Isabel for many years and who confirmed Clara's characterization. The illness was not dangerous, but it was real, a combination of a persistent lung complaint and the exhaustion of a woman who had been managing alone for too long. He prescribed rest, proper food, and company, and added with the frankness of a doctor who knew his patient that Isabel Reyes would not rest unless someone was there to make rest possible, because she was constitutionally incapable of sitting down when there was something she could be doing. "I will stay for a while," Maria told her mother. "As long as you need." "You have your life," Isabel said. "My life is here for now," Maria said, "and it is where I want it to be." Isabel looked at her, and at whatever she saw in Maria's face, she let the subject drop, which meant she was satisfied. Gideon, for his part, spent his days usefully. He had some acquaintance with San Antonio from passing through years earlier, and he began to put out inquiries about law enforcement work particularly, since it was what he knew. San Antonio in 1878 had a city marshal's office that was perpetually understaffed, dealing as it did with a city that was both genuinely civilized and genuinely rough at the edges, in the way of a frontier city that had existed for a century and a half. He spoke to the city marshal, a man named Terrence Flood, who was square-built and careful, and the conversation went well, and within 2 weeks Gideon had been offered a position as deputy city marshal that paid better than anything he had earned in Calla Creek and offered, Flood told him, a good deal more variety. He came to tell Maria about it on a warm November afternoon when she was in the rose garden with her mother, the two of them pulling the last of the season's dead growth from between the canes while Isabel directed operations from a chair she had allowed Maria to bring out from the house, ostensibly to supervise but partly, Maria suspected, because she was more tired than she admitted. He came through the gate with his hat in his hand and told them both, because by then he told Isabel most things as a matter of natural courtesy about the offer from Marshal Flood, and Isabel looked at him with those sharp, bright eyes and said, "And will you take it?" "Yes," he said, and he was looking at Maria when he said it. Maria was kneeling in the rose bed with her gardening gloves on, and her hair coming loose from its pins in the warm afternoon, and she looked up at him standing there in the golden November light with his hat in his hands and the clarity of purpose in his face, and she said, "Then I think we ought to have a conversation about certain things." Isabel picked up her cup of coffee from the small table beside her chair and studied the rose garden with the focused attention of a woman who has found something extremely interesting to look at in another direction. "I believe I need to go inside and rest," Isabel said serenely, and rose from her chair with remarkable agility for someone who had been claiming fatigue all afternoon, and went inside and closed the door. Maria pulled off her gardening gloves and stood up from the rose bed, and Gideon came to her across the garden, and when he was close enough she could see the particular quality of his attention, the absolute, unhurried focus of a man who is saying something that matters with everything he has. "I meant what I said in Abilene," he told her. "I have meant every word of it since the morning I walked up to your gate with those horses. I am in love with you, Maria. I have been for a long time." He paused. "I have a position here if I want it. I have nothing else holding me to any particular place on the map. You are where I want to be, so, if you will have me, I am asking." The November sun lay warm on the rose canes and the adobe wall and the dry garden ground. From inside the house there was the deliberate, slightly overdone quiet of a woman pretending not to listen at a distance. Maria looked at Gideon Abbott, at the steadiness and the warmth and the humor and the honesty that were all present and available in his face, and she thought about all the things that had led her here. The death of Thomas, and the long gray endurance of Calla Creek, and the letter from Clara, and the moment on the porch before dawn, when she had seen him coming up the road with the horses saddled, and the lantern swinging and the sky behind him beginning its first hint of light. And she thought about the fact that for the first time in a very long time she was not enduring anything. She was living, fully and with both hands she was living. "Yes," she said, "I will have you, Gideon Abbott." He crossed the remaining distance between them and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and it was not tentative in the way of first kisses between people who are still uncertain. It was the kiss of two people who had been certain for a while and had finally arrived at the moment where certainty was allowed to be physical. And it was warm and lasting, and when it was over they stood in the November garden with his forehead against hers and her hands on his arms, and the whole great weight of the future entirely open before them. From inside the house there was the sound, very distinctly, of something being dropped and then retrieved with cheerful energy. Maria started to laugh, and Gideon laughed too, and she called out, "Mama, you can come back outside now." And the door opened with a promptness that confirmed every suspicion. They were married in December of that year, at the San Fernando Cathedral, in a ceremony that was small by some standards and large by others. Isabel was there, dressed in her best black with the silver earrings she wore for significant occasions. Clara and Beau made the journey from Abilene, with the baby and their older daughter, a 4-year-old named Rosalie who had her mother's directness and her father's cheerfulness, which was a formidable combination. Reverend Moss had sent a letter when word reached Calla Creek, written in his characteristic long-winded style and containing genuine warmth. Sheriff Purdy sent a brief note in a barely legible hand that said only, "About time, Abbott. Good luck to you both. Purdy." Mrs. Holloway sent a card with a pressed flower in it, and the information that the new deputy from Amarillo was working out very well. Marshal Flood and 2 of the deputies attended, and there were several of Isabel's neighbors and friends from San Antonio's old Mexican-American community, women who had known Isabel since before Maria was born, and who clucked over the wedding with the proprietary satisfaction of people who have been watching a family for decades and feel entitled to share in its milestones. There was a reception in Isabel's house and courtyard afterward, with music. A man named Ernesto who played the guitar with more feeling than technique, which was exactly right, and food that Isabel had been organizing for 2 weeks despite the doctor's instructions, and which was extraordinary. Gideon stood in the courtyard of his mother-in-law's house in the late December afternoon with a glass of wine and his wife beside him. His wife, a word that was taking its time becoming real, which was fine because the reality of it was very good. And he was aware with a clarity that had a physical quality to it, a warmth in the chest, and a loosening of something he had not known was held tight, that this was where his life was, not where it was heading or where it might be. Where it was, right now, in the fact of her hand in the crook of his arm, and the sound of the guitar, and the smell of the food, and the old adobe walls going orange in the sunset. Maria looked up at him from under the brim of her wedding hat, a sensible hat, not overly elaborate, chosen with the eye of a woman who knew what she liked, and she caught his expression and she smiled at him with everything in it, the whole unguarded full force of it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am very lucky," he said. "You are," she agreed pleasantly. "But so am I." He laughed and she laughed, and Ernesto's guitar moved from something slow into something with more urgency, and Rosalie Hart, who had been waiting for exactly this development, grabbed Gideon's hand and demanded that he dance with her. And he did, spinning the 4-year-old around the courtyard while she shrieked with pleasure, and Isabel watched from her chair with her coffee and her satisfaction and her silver earrings, and everything in the world was exactly as it should be. They set up their household in San Antonio in the months that followed, in a small adobe house 3 streets from Isabel's, close enough that Maria could be with her mother daily without the 2 households being in each other's pockets, which suited everyone's temperament. The house had a walled courtyard at the back, and a good stable for the horses, and a kitchen with a proper stove that Maria regarded with something close to reverence after years of the cramped and inadequate arrangements in Calla Creek. Gideon took up his position with the city marshal's office and found it to be exactly as Marshal Flood had described: various, demanding, and ultimately satisfying in the way that work is satisfying when it is what you are made for. San Antonio in 1878 and into 1879 was a city of extraordinary contradictions, a place with deep Spanish colonial roots and a thriving Mexican-American community that had been there for generations, overlaid now with Anglo-American settlement and commerce and the cattle economy and the beginnings of the railroad, and all of these threads rubbing against each other with varying degrees of friction. There were genuine injustices to navigate: the casual dismissal of the rights of Mexican-American residents by courts that were supposed to serve everyone, the treatment of the freedmen who had come west after the war and found a freedom that was real but also limited in ways that law and custom conspired to enforce. Gideon moved through these realities with the same eyes-open honesty he brought to everything, doing what he could within the limits of his authority and being clear with himself and with Maria about those limits. Maria, for her part, began to build a life in San Antonio that was more fully hers than anything she had lived before. She worked with Mrs. Holloway's cousin, a woman named Adela Cruz, who ran a dry goods store with her husband in the market district, 3 days a week, and she helped Isabel manage the household, and she read everything she could get her hands on, which was more in San Antonio than it had been in Calla Creek, and she had opinions about all of it, which she shared with Gideon in the evenings over supper, and which he engaged with in good faith, pushing back when he thought differently and agreeing when he did, and never, not once, suggesting that she ought to have fewer opinions. Their life together had the texture of something real, not performed. They argued sometimes about how to handle a difficult situation with a neighbor whose dog kept getting into their courtyard, about money when the marshal's salary did not stretch as far as they needed, about small things that were really about larger things, as arguments in good marriages usually are. They argued fairly, which meant they argued toward something rather than at each other, and they came out the other side of disagreements feeling, generally, better understood than before, which is the correct outcome of an argument between people who are actually trying. The spring of 1879 came with a warmth that seemed to arrive all at once, the city going from the cool gray of January and February to the full-throated flowering of March in what felt like a single week. The roses in Isabel's garden came into their first early bloom, pale pink and deep red against the old adobe wall, and the air along the river was soft and full of possibility. It was in this spring that Maria told Gideon she was expecting a child. She told him at the supper table on a Tuesday evening, as plainly and directly as she told him most things, and she watched his face when the information arrived, and she would remember for the rest of her life what that looked like. He sat very still for a moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and the look on his face was so full of everything joy and wonder and a kind of fearfulness that was really just the obverse of how much he cared that she had to blink quickly. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling? When did you know?" "I have been fairly certain for 3 weeks," she said. "I went to see Dr. Vargas yesterday and he confirmed it. He says all is well." 3 weeks, he said, and there was a mild reproach in it that was mostly just the sound of a man who has realized his wife has been carrying something weighty without telling him, and he looked at her. "I wanted to be sure first," she said. I didn't want to say it and then have it not be true." He nodded slowly, turning her hand in his. "Are you afraid?" "Yes," she said honestly. "Some, are you?" "Yes," he said equally honestly. "Some." They looked at each other across the supper table in the lamplight. "Good," Maria said. "Then we are afraid the right amount and we will be fine." He laughed and she laughed, and they sat there with their hands linked across the table and the lamplight warm and the sound of the San Antonio night coming in through the window, which was the smell of the river and the last of the evening birds, and from somewhere down the street, the beginning notes of Ernesto's guitar. Isabel received the news the next morning with an expression that cycled so rapidly through surprise, delight, satisfaction, and practical concern that it was like watching weather move across a small sky. She said, "You will need to rest more than you are resting," which was the Isabel Ray's version of happiness, and she began immediately to plan for things that would not be needed for months, and Maria let her, because planning was how Isabel expressed love, and it was a good expression of it. Clara wrote a letter that arrived 3 weeks later, full of exclamation and the advice of an experienced mother and the warmth of a sister who was genuinely, effusively pleased. Beau added a postscript in his round, careful handwriting. "Congratulations to you both. Tell Abbott the first year is the hardest and the best." The summer of 1879 was hot, as San Antonio summers were hot, with a dry, fierce heat that turned the sky white by midday and drove people into their shaded courtyards in the afternoons. Maria found the heat harder than usual and spent the hottest hours inside, reading or sewing or talking with her mother. And Gideon came home from the marshal's office in the evenings looking like a man who has been in an oven. And they sat in the courtyard in the late evenings when the heat eased, and the stars came out, and he told her about his day, and she told him about hers, and they were, in the deepest and most ordinary sense, happy. Their son was born in October of 1879, on a cool, clear day when the roses had put out their final autumn flush of bloom, filling the street outside with a sweetness that Maria would always associate afterward with the particular quality of that day's light. It was a hard labor, longer than Dr. Vargas would have liked, and Gideon spent most of it in the courtyard outside the bedroom with the focused stillness of a man exercising every ounce of his self-control. And when Dr. Vargas finally opened the door and said that everything was well and that he had a healthy son, Gideon sat down on the courtyard bench and put his head in his hands for a moment that no one mentioned or would ever mention. Isabel was in the room with Maria, and it was Isabel's voice and Isabel's hands that were there through the worst of it. And afterward Maria lay with the small, red-faced, furious person who was her son, and felt something she had no adequate words for, which was the enormity of loving something this new and this completely. Gideon came in when they let him, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with an expression that Maria recognized as the same one she was wearing, overwhelmed, undone, grateful beyond anything ordinary speech could manage. He reached out and the baby's hand closed around his finger with a strength that surprised him. "What do we name him?" Maria asked. They had discussed names but had not settled. "I had been thinking," Gideon said slowly, "about Samuel, for no particular reason except that it suits him if he looks to me like a Samuel." Maria looked at her son's face, small and creased and absolutely new, and said, "Samuel Abbott, yes, that suits him." "Samuel Ray's Abbott," Gideon said, offering her mother's name, and he said it with a simplicity that made Isabel, who was in the corner pretending to fold a blanket, turn away toward the wall for a moment. "Samuel Ray's Abbott," Maria agreed, and it was settled. The years that followed were the years of a full life, which is to say they contained everything: joy and difficulty and growth and occasional heartbreak, and the long, deep satisfaction of building something real. Gideon rose in the marshal's office, becoming senior deputy by 1881, and taking on responsibilities that suited his particular combination of intelligence and steadiness, and the ability to walk into a tense situation and bring it down from dangerous to manageable by force of presence alone. He was known in the city as a fair man, which in that time and place was not a small or easy thing to be known as. He made enemies of the people who expected law enforcement to look the other way from the mistreatment of the city's Mexican-American and black residents, and he made those enemies without apology, and Maria was proud of this in a way she told him when they lay in the dark at night and reviewed the world honestly. Maria's life expanded in ways that Calla Creek had never allowed. She began to read law, not systematically but voraciously, borrowing books from a lawyer named Hector Murrells who had taken a shine to her intelligence and her questions. She helped Adela Cruz manage an increasingly complex business and discovered that she had a gift for accounts and for the negotiation of supply arrangements that surprised people who had not been paying close attention to her. She became involved, carefully and incrementally, with a small group of women in San Antonio who were trying to establish a school for the children of the city's poorest families, families who were predominantly Mexican-American, whose children had limited access to the schools that the city nominally provided, and whose futures depended in ways that were both obvious and politically inconvenient on whether someone was willing to teach them to read. This work was not without difficulty. There were people in San Antonio who thought a woman of Maria's background, the widow of a small-time Anglo rancher, married to a deputy marshal, not from any of the city's established families, was not the appropriate person to be organizing educational projects, and there were people who thought educational projects for poor Mexican-American children were not appropriate at all, and Maria dealt with both categories of opposition with a patience that was real but finite. And occasionally, in the evenings at the supper table, the finite nature of that patience became audible. "The city council," she said one evening in a tone that made Gideon look up from his supper, "has decided to review the application for the building permit again." "The third time," he said. "The third time," she agreed. "Mr. Kavanaugh made a speech about the proper use of city resources. He used the phrase appropriate populations 3 times. What are you going to do?" She cut her meat with the deliberate care of someone managing their own energy. I am going to speak to Hector Merles about the specific legal grounds on which the permit can and cannot be denied, and I am going to prepare a written response that makes it impossible for anyone on that council to deny the permit without having to state explicitly and on the record exactly why they are doing it. He looked at her across the table. That will make some people very uncomfortable. Good, she said, with a sweetness that did not reach her eyes. He reached across and refilled her coffee cup. Let me know what I can do. You can come to the meeting, she said, not in any official capacity, just sitting in the back row. I will be in the back row, he said. She got the permit. It took 2 more months and 3 more meetings, but she got it, and the school opened in a rented building on a side street in the spring of 1882, with 43 children on the first morning, and Maria stood in the doorway and watched them file in with their serious faces and their carefully cleaned clothes, and she felt a satisfaction that was deeper than personal, which was the satisfaction of having done something that would matter beyond the moment. By the time Samuel was 3, he was already showing the fearless curiosity of a child who has been raised in a household where questions are welcomed and opinions are expressed, and books are present in every room. He followed both his parents with the dogged, determined shadow attachment of a toddler, and he followed Gideon with a particular intensity when Gideon was grooming the horses, standing in the stable on his short legs, and talking to Redeemer and Belle with the same serious conversational tone he used with people, which the horses appeared to appreciate. Gideon taught him to sit in the saddle at 3½, first just sitting still on Belle's back with Gideon's hands on either side of him, and the look on Samuel's face at finding himself up there. The complete and total seriousness of a child confronting a significant occasion was one that Maria captured in her memory with the care she applied to the things that would need to outlast the moment they belonged to. Isabel's health improved through 1879 and 1880, helped by the proximity of her daughter and son-in-law, and the enormous project of being a grandmother to Samuel, which she undertook with the same systematic devotion she brought to her roses. By 1881, she was moving around the city with an energy that made Dr. Vargas shake his head and say that he had never yet found an effective prescription for stubbornness, which he meant as a compliment. She taught Samuel to count in Spanish before he could count reliably in English, and she told him stories about Chihuahua when she was a girl, and she pressed flowers from her garden and put them between the pages of a journal she was keeping for him, and she was, in the most complete sense, present. In the spring of 1883, their daughter was born. They named her Clara Isabel, after both her aunts and her grandmother folded into 2 names, and Clara Isabel entered the world with a fullness of voice that suggested strong opinions from the outset, and Maria looked at her daughter's face on the first morning and said, "Hello, Clara Isabel Abbott. You are going to be a great deal of trouble, and I love you already completely." Gideon held her that evening, the baby small and sleeping in his arms, and said quietly, "How are we this lucky?" Maria was tired in the deep bone-level way of new mothers, and she looked at him with his dark hair and the lines that were beginning to appear at the corners of his eyes, lines that had not been there in Calla Creek, and she thought about the road that had brought them here. The fire burned to coals, and the silence and the pre-dawn dark and the sound of his voice at her gate. "I am coming with you," and she said, "because we had the sense to take it when it was offered." He looked at her over the baby's head, and the love in his face was the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that has been tested by time and difficulty and ordinary life, and has not diminished but deepened, and she looked back at him with the same thing, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Samuel took Clara Isabel's arrival with the philosophical equanimity of a 3-year-old who has been carefully prepared, and then with the possessive territorial pride of a big brother who has decided that this person is his, and anyone who does not understand this will be informed. He brought her small objects from around the house, a smooth stone he had found in the courtyard, a feather, a battered tin soldier, and arranged them around her basket as tribute, with the solemn ceremony of a child enacting a serious ritual. Gideon watched this and said quietly to Maria, "I think he may have misunderstood what babies do in terms of appreciating tribute items." And Maria said, "Let him figure it out," and they let him, and he did. The school thrived. By 1884, it had outgrown the rented building and Maria was in negotiations. Again, with the city council, this time for a small piece of city land on which to build properly. Hector Murrells was her legal counsel and her advisor, and by now her genuine friend, and he navigated the city's bureaucracy with the easy expertise of a man who had been working within and against its limitations for 20 years. They won the land grant in the fall of 1884, and a committee of men and women from the neighborhood raised the building over the following winter, and it opened in March of 1885 as the Rays School, named for Isabel, who came to the opening ceremony in her best black with her silver earrings and her roses in her hands, and was presented to the assembled parents and children with an introduction that made her close her eyes for a moment in a way that was not entirely about the strain of standing in the sun. Gideon became city marshal in 1885, when Terence Flood retired due to age, and the recommendation of the previous marshal went to Gideon without serious challenge. He took the position with the same steady purpose he had brought to everything, and his tenure as city marshal was, by the accounts of the people who lived under it, characterized by an insistence on consistency that was genuinely unusual. He was not loved by those who had expected law in San Antonio to continue serving the powerful at the expense of everyone else, and he was loved by nearly everyone else, which he regarded as a reasonable trade. In the evenings of those years, they sat in their courtyard in San Antonio, where Maria had eventually planted her own roses from cuttings from Isabel's garden, and they were the evenings of a life that had been fully chosen and fully lived. Samuel growing tall and serious and full of questions, already showing signs of the same appetite for reading that characterized his mother, already showing the same way of tilting his head to consider a thing from every angle that characterized his father. Clara Isabel growing strong and forthright and funny, with her grandmother's dark eyes and her father's steady constitution, and her mother's precise and unsparing tongue, which she deployed at the dinner table to great effect. Isabel was still alive at 80, still in her house, still tending her roses, still making coffee with a cinnamon stick in it, still presiding over the neighborhood with the authority of a woman who has lived long enough in a place to be its memory. She was slower, and the winter days were harder, and she slept more than she once had, but her mind was as clear as creek water and her opinions were as sharply maintained as they had always been. And she sat with Maria in the evenings sometimes and talked about the old country and the new country and everything between, and Maria sat with her and listened with the listening of someone who understands that these conversations are finite and sacred. On a Sunday morning in October of 1887, 9 years, almost to the day, after Maria had stood on her porch in Calla Creek and watched a man come up the road through the pre-dawn dark with 2 horses and a lantern, Maria and Gideon sat in the courtyard after the children had gone to school, with their coffee, and the roses around them were in their last autumn flush, and the sky above the walls of the courtyard was the deep, brilliant blue of a Texas October. There was nothing particular about this morning except everything, which is often the way with the mornings you come to remember. "Tell me what you are thinking," he said. She looked at her roses and thought about the morning in Calla Creek, and about Clara's letter, and about nothing holding her there, and about the lantern swinging through the dark and the breath of the horses in the cold air and the sky just beginning to change on the eastern edge. "I am thinking about first light," she said, "in Calla Creek." He looked at her and she looked at him, and he knew exactly what she meant. He reached across the small table and took her hand, and she turned it in his and felt the familiar particular warmth of it, the hand she knew better than any other thing in the world. "I was terrified," he said, and it was the first time he had admitted this. "You were." I walked those horses to your house and stood at the gate, and I thought, she might tell me to take them home. She might get in the freight wagon and leave, and that will be the end of it." He looked at the roses. "I do not know what I would have done, probably spent the next 10 years being unbearable about it." "You were not unbearable about Ellen," she said. "I was not in love with Ellen the way I was in love with you," he said simply. "Ellen was something I thought might become what I was looking for. You were already it." Maria held his hand in both of hers and looked at the sky above the courtyard walls, and the love she felt was the kind that is indistinguishable from everything else, from the smell of the roses and the warmth of the coffee cup, and the sound of the city waking up around the walls, and the knowledge that Samuel and Clara Isabel would be home in the afternoon with their noise and their needs and their extraordinary aliveness. It was not separate from any of that. It was the whole of it. "I am glad I did not get in the freight wagon," she said. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, and she felt the warmth of it the way she felt the warmth of everything in this life, all the way through. The afternoon the letter arrived from Clara, Maria was in the kitchen. Samuel was at the table doing his schoolwork with the furious concentration of a boy who has been set a problem he is not going to be beaten by. And Clara Isabel was in the courtyard talking to the horses through the stable door in the grave. Thorough way she had of addressing animals and adults she respected. Gideon was at the marshal's office, and Maria was making the cinnamon coffee the way her mother had taught her, and the house smelled of it, and the afternoon sun was coming through the kitchen window in that long October slant. And when she opened the letter she read it twice, and then she sat down at the table very carefully. Clara wrote that she and Beau were thinking of moving south. Beau's business had grown to where San Antonio made more sense than Abilene, and their children were nearly grown, and the city called to them. Would Maria and Gideon mind having them near? Samuel looked up from his schoolwork and saw her face. "Is something wrong, Mama?" "Nothing is wrong," she said. "Your aunt and uncle may be coming to San Antonio." He thought about this. "Aunt Clara talks a lot," he said, with the assessed judgment of an 8-year-old. "She does," Maria agreed. "It is one of her best qualities." He went back to his problem, and Maria folded the letter and put it in her pocket and thought about her family, gathering itself toward her across the width of Texas. And she was so grateful for all of it that the gratitude had nowhere to go but into everything she did for the rest of the afternoon, which she did with a particular attention and care, the coffee just right. The supper started early, and when Gideon came home and found her like this, warm and present in the kitchen of their house, he did not ask what had happened but simply came and kissed her, and she put her hand against his face, and the day resolved itself into evening. Clara and Beau arrived in the spring of 1888, with their children, Rosalie now a composed and self-possessed young woman of 14, and young Beau, who was 12 and considerably less composed. And the house they rented was 4 streets away, and the dinner table that Friday evening was full of voices and wine and Ernesto's guitar, because someone had found him still playing on the same corner, older but no quieter, and brought him to the gathering. And Isabel sat at the head of the table in her black dress and her silver earrings, and presided over all of it with the satisfaction of a woman who had built this, piece by piece, through decades of tenacity and love. Isabel died in the winter of 1889, in her own house, in her own bed, with Maria beside her and Gideon in the doorway, and the smell of her roses coming in from the courtyard where they had been pruned back against the cold. She went quietly, in the way of people who have said what needed to be said and done what needed to be done and are finally, reasonably, tired. She was 72 years old. The neighborhood mourned her in the way of neighborhoods that have known someone long enough to be shaped by them. The Ray School sent its students to the funeral in their best clothes, and they stood at the graveside in the cold winter morning, with the stillness of children who understand that something large has passed. And Maria stood with Gideon's arm around her, and said goodbye to her mother with a sorrow that was the cleanest kind. Because it was unambiguous Isabel Reyes had lived a full life and been loved fully, and left a world that was better for her presence in it. And that was all any of us could reasonably hope for. The grief was real and it was tended. Clara stayed for 2 months, and the sisters talked about their mother in the evenings with the exhaustive thoroughness of daughters processing the loss of the person who made them. And Gideon gave Maria room to grieve and was present in the ways that mattered without trying to manage or shorten the process, which was one of the things she had always known about him and would always be grateful for. By spring she was through the worst of it, and the roses in her courtyard, grown now from Isabel's cuttings, carrying Isabel's garden forward into the next generation, bloomed in April with a fullness that seemed to her deliberate, which she knew was the kind of thing a grieving person thinks but thought anyway. Samuel was 10 that spring, and he had begun to talk about the law in the way of a boy who has been listening to his father's cases at the dinner table for years, and has found in it something that answers something in him. He asked Gideon precise questions about legal procedure that Gideon answered honestly, including the honest answers that were about the ways law fell short of justice, which he thought Samuel needed to understand as clearly as the formal structure. He asked Maria about the school and why it was hard to get the city's cooperation, and she gave him equally honest answers, and he listened with his father's head-tilted considering look and came back the next day with more questions, which they answered. Clara Isabel, who was 6, was less interested in legal theory and more interested in horses and mathematics, and the precise mechanics of how her grandmother's roses had produced the roses now growing in their courtyard, which she understood was a question of cuttings and biology, and which she had interrogated Gideon about with a thoroughness that had made him go to the library to find her a proper answer, because she deserved a proper answer. She was also interested in baking, specifically in the question of why some batches of biscuits rose properly and others did not, which had led to a sustained experimental program conducted in Maria's kitchen over several weeks, and resulting in a notebook of observations that was one of the most methodical documents in the household. These were their children. These were the people they had made between them, out of the long, improbable journey from a burned-down fire in a small house in Calla Creek to this house in San Antonio with the roses and the courtyard, and the smells of coffee and supper, and the horses in the stable. When Maria thought about this, which she did sometimes on the quiet mornings in the courtyard when the world had not yet started its noise, she thought about the word ordinary and whether it was the right word. It was ordinary in the sense that most days contain nothing dramatic, that life was made of routines and small moments and the incremental accumulation of days. But it did not feel small. It felt, in the truest sense, large as the Texas sky that still, when she looked at it, made her feel both free and wonderfully present, as it had the first time she had seen it as a girl. In the autumn of 1890, Gideon was reappointed city marshal for a 3rd term, and at the small gathering that followed the appointment, Maria stood in the receiving line next to him and shook hands with city councilmen and businessmen and neighbors, and the parents of children from the Ray's school, and a woman from the freedmen's settlement east of the city who brought a jar of preserves and said to Gideon, "My husband says you are the reason he was not run off his land last year. I want you to know we see it." And Gideon had thanked her simply and without deflection, and Maria had watched him do it and thought, there he is. There is exactly the man he said he was trying to be. Right there. On their 12th wedding anniversary, December of 1890, they went to the cathedral in the morning. The same cathedral, the same weather, the same smell of cedar and candle wax, and the particular stone-cold clarity of an old church in winter. And they sat in the pew where they had sat to be married, and they were quiet together in the way of two people who have learned the full value of shared silence. Afterward they walked along the river, the San Antonio River going silver and cold between its banks in the December light, the cypresses stripped for winter, a heron standing motionless in the shallows with the perfect patience of something that has no need to be anywhere else. He took her hand as they walked, and she leaned into him slightly, and they walked along the river of the city that had become their home, past the old missions and the new buildings and the market and the school, past the full accumulated texture of 12 years of a life that had been chosen and built and tended with care. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me." "I have been thinking that when Samuel is through school and able to manage more on his own, I would like to take you somewhere," he said. "Just us. I was thinking Tennessee. I have not been back in a long time and my mother is getting older." She looked up at him. "Tennessee. Green," he said. "Very green. I think you would like it." She thought about it, the idea of the green that he had described on their second day of riding, the Tennessee green that was different from the Texas spread, a different kind of beauty for a different kind of country. She thought about his mother, whom she had never met, a woman in her late 60s now, living in Tennessee with a daughter and her family. "I would like that," she said. He smiled at her, and it was the same smile she had first seen on the porch behind the sheriff's office when she had brought him pie on a late summer evening 6 years before they had stood at this river. The one that transformed his face, that made the restraint and the steadiness part and showed what was underneath, which was warm and real and completely his. "Then we will go," he said, "when the time is right." They walked on along the Silver River, and the heron lifted itself from the water on its wide, slow wings and moved upstream ahead of them with the unhurried certainty of something that knows exactly where it is going. And they watched it go, and the December light lay quiet on everything, and the city moved around them in its ordinary, extraordinary way, and they were, in the deepest and most durable sense of the word, home. The years did not stop, their years do not stop, which is one of their great gifts, but the shape of the life was fully made. Samuel would indeed study law at a college in Austin, and he would come back to San Antonio and practice it, and he would argue cases that mattered in courts that were slow to change and fast to disappoint, and he would argue them with the patience of someone who has been taught by people who did not quit. Clara Isabel would become a teacher, not the Ray's school specifically, though she worked there some summers, but a teacher in the more complicated sense of someone who goes wherever the need is most acute, and she would do it with the systematic rigor and the warmth that had been in her since the day she cataloged her biscuit experiments in a small notebook. Gideon would serve as city marshal until 1895, when he retired with his knees less cooperative than they had been, and a clear sense that he had done the work fully, and it was time to give the work to someone new. He would spend his retirement doing things that had been deferred by the demands of the job, building a better stable, reading the books he had not had time for, teaching his grandchildren when they arrived, to sit on a horse with the same serious ceremony he had taught Samuel. And he would be in the courtyard every morning with his coffee, and Maria would bring hers and sit across from him, and the roses would be there, and the sky would be there, and the city would be there around the walls, and all of it would be as it had always been between them, steady and warm and chosen, freely and fully, again, every single day. Maria would sit in that courtyard on the mornings she had to herself and think, sometimes, about the woman she had been in Calla Creek, the woman who had been enduring, who had packed her bags in the pre-dawn dark with no particular belief that anything was waiting for her on the other side of the leaving, only the obligation to her mother and the gray persistence of a person who does what needs to be done. And she would think about what it had taken, not courage exactly, or not only courage, but the willingness to unlatch a gate in the dark, the willingness to say yes when yes was frightening, the willingness to take the thing that was offered with both hands. She had done that. And she was here. And when the day ended and the evening came and Gideon came to find her wherever she was in the house or the garden, and she heard his footsteps and looked up to find his face, the same face that had come up the road through the pre-dawn dark with the horses saddled and the lantern swinging and the whole open country behind him, she felt, with the completeness of something that has long since been settled, the rightness of it, the unambiguous, irreducible rightness. She had left Calla Creek at first light. He had the horses saddled and he had come with her, and that, in the end, had been everything.